All right, we are live now. Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the panel about event sourcing, really, with Alexey Zimarev. Alexey, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Alexey, as Kasper said. Thank you for a short introduction. I work as chief architect in ABAX and as developer advocate in Event Store, which is the event sourcing database. So I guess, and I also wrote the book, Domain-Driven Design. Oh, it's actually right here, this one. So
well done.
It is the event sourcing book in disguise, and I guess I can talk about event sourcing for a bit of time. So because I build event source systems and run them in production.
Great. All right, so a couple of things before we start this panel. So because it's a panel, we would like to have a proper discussion. So there is a couple of ways in which you can contribute to this panel. One of them is asking questions on Q&A, and I will be able then to read these questions out loud to Alexey, and Alexey will be able to address them. Second way of asking questions is to type them on the YouTube chat. I will be monitoring that and also passing these questions to Alexey. And third way, which I would like to encourage, is by raising your hand in the panel. So on the Zoom, you can, on the attendee list, on the bottom right corner, there is a raise hand button. If you click that button, I will see that there's a blue icon next to you, and I will let you speak. So I will allow you to talk, and you will be able to join the call and have a conversation with Alexey. I think that's it. So I would like to start with the first opening question from me, which is really about the types of domains where you think event sourcing works really well, and where you would recommend that event sourcing could be a good fit.
Right. So first and foremost, I strongly believe that event sourcing as such is the, first really usable persistence mechanism that allows us to store not just arbitrary changes of state, but also kind of persist the behavior of the user, because we say the domain model is anemic if it just has a state, and it's rich if it has behavior. And where we concentrate on behavior, we try to capture the intent of our users, but we're never been able to persist it. So that's why I think as soon as the domain has certain complex behavior, then it's worth using event sourcing for that domain. And in addition to that, domains that have complex processes that are not easy to track, and there is a time aspect involved. So the process lasts longer than three things, like 3-state transitions, for example, or I don't know, that's an arbitrary number, so you can choose yours. Then you would benefit from using event sourcing in that kind of domain.
Right, thank you for that. We have a first question from the attendee. So it's Duncan Jones. I think you're familiar with him. So he's asking, how do you deal with sets of entities in an event sourced system? For example, if you have a query, get all the accounts with a balance that has more than $1 million in the account.
Well, it's this is where CQRS takes place, because as Greg said back in during his talk, the decade of event sourcing and CQRS, he always thought that CQRS is just a stepping stone towards event sourcing. So there are not that many people that do event sourcing with DDD in mind, and we on DDD conference, so I have to mention it, that do not do CQRS. And when you involve CQRS, the second thing you start building in parallel with your domain model and event-based persistence, also your read models. And in that query storage that you choose, you can do whatever. You put an index on a table that contains your account state or any kind of projected state of your entities. Then it becomes trivial. It's just as normal query as it would be with any other, with a normal state-based persistence. It's just it's lagging behind, and of course, the lag depends on how fast your projection is. So if you don't use CQRS with event sourcing, then probably you should, because querying entities using events is not easy. I would say that I would rather not do that.
Have you ever actually seen a person doing event sourcing without CQRS and without?
No, not really, no.
Okay, so it's not really feasible.
Well, it is, I think, feasible. It's just depending. I think there are domains, very narrow, very niche domains, where you can just keep, I mean, you will still need to see your later state, but you can, for example, use, the problem is that, of course, you can only retrieve entity by ID, and not taking into account that you need to reconstruct your entity using all the events in the stream and maybe snapshots. But it's just like, it behaves like a key value store on steroids because it needs to rehydrate entity from all events. What it automatically means that you could capture event of a specific type, the last event from the stream of a specific type, to understand a piece of state that is actual. But it still needs to go by ID, and you cannot run a query with balances. Event store as a product has internal projections, but they have performance impact on the infrastructure. So I would be careful with this. But it's still CQRS of some sorts.
Thank you for the answer. So we have first question on the Q&A on Zoom. So that's from Łukasz Szydło, and he's asking, how can you handle bulk state changes?
Yeah, bulk state changes are not easy, because I would say we need a bit of context here. Bulk state changes can be triggered by multiple sources. One of the sources, for example, is migration from another system. If this is happening once, then that's not a problem to emit the migration events. Then you kind of initialize your system. For example, you move from legacy to event source system, and then you want to have the actual state of all your entities that are already there. So what do? You create a specific event saying migrate from legacy, and then emit thousands of potentially millions of them. And that's not a problem because it's only happening once. I worked in a system that used to have bulk updates coming every night, and there were a few million records coming. Then you need to be really careful. Maybe it's not something you want, because the bulk update rarely comes from the domain, your own domain. It's most of the time comes from the outside. And maybe the only thing you need is basically just consider that event as an external event that comes to your domain and trigger read model change. So you don't need to take this information into your domain model sorts, and use domain services if you want to reach out to that information from your application service or an aggregate. If your system inherently has this complexity of bulk updates, I would say either you might need to spend time on modeling it a bit better, or you don't use event sourcing, or you probably have a need to remodel your aggregate, because then it will become a bit, maybe a huge event with a lot of updates in it. So it depends on the context. Unfortunately, we don't have that much details. But yeah, there are ways to do that.
Right. Thank you for the answer. Łukasz, if you want to, Alexey, to expand on the answer, please ask more specific question. So we have two more questions on the panel. Are there any frameworks, probably based on event store, that you can recommend for event sourcing CQRS? Or is rolling your own the only real way?
What language?
Not specified.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to specify without knowing what you do. C#, okay. So we always use sort of self-baked frameworks because, again, I can refer to Greg. He's not a big fan of frameworks. So you don't need a framework to do event sourcing. At the same time, a friend of mine, a colleague Sergio, he says the cake is a lie. So you can't really jump into and do proper production-ready event sourcing without having some lifting upfront. So you actually create something for your own use that enables you to build proper event sourcing system and spend time on modeling your domain and implementing it instead of spending time on dealing with complexity of event sourcing. However, everywhere where we implement event source systems, we prefer to start with kind of creating building blocks ourselves, because it's a very good start. It gives you a lot of insights on how event sourcing really works, because if you isolate this, then there is a risk that developers will get confused because they don't know what actually happens. They consider half of the stuff as magic, and the last thing you want in your system is something happening by magic. So I would rather avoid this. So if the code for my book, for example, is publicly available in Puck Publishing common repository, you can find relatively okay code that you could use in production to handle event sourcing. It doesn't handle scenarios like advanced versioning or migrations and stuff like that, but it can handle a lot. So, and from there, it's a good start. You can evolve it and create your own deviations and basically just look at someone else's code. I think my code is decent, and go from there and create your own stuff that suits your needs.
Right, thank you for the answer. Next question. There is a window to implement event source system, but lacking the capture of the end user intentions in your commands. Do you have insight about how to foster and force end user intentions oriented commands like task oriented UIs?
Yeah, you said it all. I mean, task-based UI is essential when you want to capture the intent of users, because the last thing you want in your event source system when you have events that represent every particular state transition in ubiquitous language described as events is that your UI looks like an edit button, then you go to a huge form, and then there is a save button down there, and all these fields are not related and probably even go across your aggregate boundaries. So you need to issue multiple commands. So I'd say sometimes you do have a possibility just for sake of UX. You need to really consult with your UX expert on that to combine several commands coming from one single screen, from one single action that is executed on the user interface. Preferably, of course, you would not do that and go for task-based UIs from the start. That it makes the intent much more prominent for users as well, because users really like that. And if you see the evolution of user interfaces, for example, in mobile user interfaces, it's very hard to find sort of edit and save button. It's usually something you do in settings or something you manipulate. It's immediately triggered. It immediately triggers the change in the system. And it might be executing command, might be not, but it looks like it. So I think web UI is like kind of lagging behind this kind of interfaces. And I was just looking at Zoom settings before the session, and they don't have any save buttons or apply or whatever else. They just have a screen, you change the settings, and they're applying as you do that. And this is the way of capturing the intent. So I would say, yeah, task-based UI is for the win. But you need a good UX expert, and you need to explain the concept to them. Some of them actually naturally kind of grasping it, because if you look at the UI books or UX books and concepts down there, they are very prominent to do the same. They just maybe call it differently. But I think UX is important to align with your domain as well.
Thank you, Alexey. So that was a question from Thomas. Thank you, Thomas, for the question. Next one is coming from YouTube, again from Duncan Jones. And the question is, would you recommend having the event sourcing data kept in the same physical location, for example, single server or single cloud location?
I'm not sure about what location means in this context. I would say that it is, there we come to the architecture. It's not really the design. And it's operational concern. It depends on what product you use. For example, if you use Event Store, then it has certain decent performance. But when it comes to certain volumes, then it begin to struggle. So I would say that we do not have that we say, okay, we have a service, and the service is like technical authority for business capability. So we define the boundaries of a service that basically match the bounded context. It's just another word for it. And it can have multiple microservices inside, but they all reach out to the same storage. When you go to another context, it uses it could use the same event store, but then you need to have clear separation. For example, event store as such doesn't support multi-tenancy out of the box, at least for now. I hope it will in the future. And then you could do multi-tenancy yourself. For example, you can just prefix all the streams with something that belongs to that context or another context. And you need to have a decent degree of discipline not to reach out to events that are internal to another context, because you would then conform to them. So I would not have this limitation, like set up a separate storage per se, but usually it's a good idea. If you can afford it, why not?
Thank you, Alexey. Next question is from Zoom, Elaine Jensens. As we all know, all models are wrong, some are useful. How do you handle model changes if you already have millions of events?
Yeah, very good question. I usually do not advise people to start doing event sourcing if you are not clear on what you're gonna do. So when your domain model is the subject to change because your domain experts don't really know what they're doing, it's typically happening not in the classic sort of business line application when the application tries to automate processes that were previously done manually, or improve existing systems and basically replicate their workflow. But if you work in a product company, then it's sometimes become harder because you have inputs from a lot of users and some needs are conflicting and you don't really know what you're doing because you have a target group of customers that kind of dictate what you're going to do, that you have potential customers that may come later and say, what the crap, and we need to change, and then you pivot. So if you don't really know what you're doing, maybe it's you start with a state-driven system. There are downsides of that. Because I got burned by it once because I missed the intent again, and I could have remodeled easier. So if you end up in a situation that your model is just entirely incorrect, you can start from scratch, because you can snapshot all your streams and kind of create an entity set that represents the state of the system at this particular moment. And then you emit new events in new streams that basically start up a new system, a new model. If your changes are more subtle, so they're not dramatic, then you can just migrate or upcast events. Of course, versioning plays a significant role there. So when you make breaking changes in events, you need to introduce new versions of those events. And at some point, you might end up that you have multiple event handlers for the same kind of event category or global type, but the versions are different. But that's fine, because they only leave there until you decide, okay, I don't need that much history. I can cut it a little bit. So I just move completely to the new version. So Greg wrote a book about strategies of dealing with migrations, event versioning, stuff like that. It's available on LeanPub. So go there, and it's a very good book, particularly addressing that issue.
Thank you, Alexey. Question from YouTube again, from Konrad Jakubiec. Would you put time-based domain events, for example, financial year ended, in some specific stream? Generally, how to bake time-based events into the event source system?
I have experience having time-based events, not in finance system, but also the day end in event source system, and we were doing that. It was reasonable. Would I do it again? It depends. If the event triggers a process, maybe I don't need it. Maybe I can just publish event in the message broker and just say, okay, this is what I do. If I want to capture the state transition that is triggered by this day change, for example, then I might need to write it down because it has a state change. So imagine this, that events represent state transitions. They are not commands. Commands just say, okay, I want to do that. And you might say, no, you can't do that. Events is something that happened, and it doesn't need to be what happened in the real world. It captured the intent that is relevant for your system, what the main expert cares about. So if there is no state transition, you probably don't want an event to be persisted. And if you talk about integration, you use different techniques, like just using pub/sub in a broker. So again, it's very context specific. But I've seen it before, and it worked. Was it successful? I don't know. If there is a trigger and somehow the reaction loses its checkpoint and it moves back, then it can produce unexpected results because it will trigger the date change again. So yeah, I would be careful about it.
Thank you. So now we have a question from anonymous attendee. Lately, I've heard a few event sourcing and CQRS practitioners rejecting some DDD tactical patterns such as aggregates, entities, or value object concepts. Would you implement an event source system without applying those DDD patterns?
Absolutely. I mean, event sourcing is a persistence mechanism, as I said. So you have a system essentially represented by your domain model. You still have a domain model, though you might call it differently, whatever, class model or set of functions, but there is a state, and the system transitions from one state to another, and you represent this transition as an event, and you persist it. If you do not use, I mean, some people say the aggregate concept is rubbish and I want to call everything an entity. Okay, fine. Then your entity, what is your entity boundary? And the boundary of the entity is the boundary of your transactions. So everything that happens transactionally on that particular business object is your entity. This is essentially the aggregate pattern. If you don't like the name, don't use the name. I'm fine with that. But if you have a stream of events that are particularly stored state transitions for one single business object, and this is all the state changes happen transactionally, and you only need to reach out to events in this stream to understand if you can execute the command or not, so protect the environment. This is an aggregate if you want to use the term or not. If the value objects, the same. I mean, value objects have their place, and sometimes I've seen tons of event source systems that do not use value objects just because there is some complexity and some extra work involved in dealing with them. So I'd say if you find it useful, use it. If you don't find it useful, don't use it. It's tactics. Concerning another kind of flavor of event source systems, that the whole system is represented in a single event stream. This will require you that will keep the entity state somewhere else as a read model. Would you call it read model or not? I don't really care, but this is a snapshot of your system. If you keep it in the same store, you will end up having a lot of snapshots, and that they will produce with every event. And you need to take care about operational concerns. If you store it somewhere else, you have to face commits. So like I update my event store and I put the state somewhere else in the same transaction, and it's not always feasible. If you do it as a read model, so it has some degree of eventual consistency, you have risk that you're making decision on the stale data. So I would be very careful. I know a lot of event sources do not rehydrate entities or aggregates every time they need to read it and aggregate back. So they keep sort of snapshot of state somewhere else. It's legit pattern. It's just that you need to be very careful not having these issues. So you need to be consistent on the right side of CQRS always, because otherwise you can't make proper decisions.
Thank you. So question from Vladas. You advise to build the building blocks of event source system yourself. What about building the event store yourself? When is the good idea building it yourself, and when would you pick up off-the-shelf product like event store?
Yeah, I wouldn't dare building a document database myself on the file system, although I can do that. It's just I know that it will suck in some places where I don't even think about it. It wouldn't scale properly and stuff like that. So I'd say that if you have the possibility to use off-the-shelf products, that's what we do. We take ready-made things and use it for our benefit, so we don't spend time implementing something that's already implemented by people that we pay a little bit of money. And comparing the cost of implementing something yourself, you always evaluate it against the cost of buying it. So buying stuff is good because it's just ready-made and there are engineers behind it that will support you and will help you, and have other paying customers, and you get feature development and stuff like that. And if you do it yourself, you will end up doing all the work on your own, and instead of doing the features or evolve your domain model, you will spend time building infrastructure products. So we don't build databases ourselves unless this is our business. So look at, some people say you want to build, you want to apply event source in your core domain. Definitely building databases is not your core domain unless your business is building and selling databases. But you can try out some things out of a need, like Damon Hickey and the team implemented SQL Stream Store because they couldn't use Event Store for compliance reasons or whatever restrictions they had in the company. So they decided to build Event Store based on a SQL Server or other relational database. And it worked pretty well. But even go to the repo and look how much time it took them from the initial version to the current version, addressing all the issues they encounter. It's quite a lot, to be honest. So Greg again said that the event store is nothing else, that you can shovel events to the system with append-only fashion and put index on top of that so you can read them by stream, because the event store internally just appends events in the end of the file until the chunk grows too big, and then it starts a new chunk. But it puts an index on top of that so you can read events for one particular stream and do it really fast. Another thing that you need to take care of, if you use Sakurasan and you build read models, you need to have real-time subscription. It needs to be really real-time, because otherwise you will end up with a eventual consistency with very big projection gap in time, not in count. So if you are able to solve this yourself, maybe you are able to build a proper event store, and sometimes you can just use products that have a proper data change stream, like, for example, Cosmos DB or Amazon Dynamo with Kinesis streams and stuff like that. It's just, there will be heavy lifting up front anyway. So if you want to do that, why not? It's a good programming exercise, I'd say. I wouldn't do it.
All right. Question from Mateusz Nowak. Should every bounded context have its own event store? If yes, how should I create projections from my whole system, events from any bounded context? If no, how not to expose all stored events to all other bounded contexts?
Yeah, it's a very good one. So I'd say that every bounded context has its own global sequence of events. So if we separate event stores, there is never a guarantee that integration works real time in the way you want. So when it comes to integration between bound contexts, the time aspect becomes more relevant, because it might take a few minutes until another bound context reacts on that. And where the events for that bound context will be written in terms of what sequence it gets, it doesn't matter, soon they applied in order, and they actually are. So I'd say there is no requirement for you to keep one single event store. You can have multiple of those, and your reporting context as such is a context. If you build projections on the side to kind of consolidate information from multiple bounded context, would it be in the same event store or other event stores, you can do it. You subscribe to multiple event stores, and then you have multiple subscriptions going on. You can use timestamps. You can do whatever. Use some versions that are correlated between bounded contexts to coordinate if you need strong sequential processing. But I would like to accent that we really do not have this linear. It's linear within a bound context. When it comes to another bound context, it's not kind of following your order anymore. It's still like, if something happened here, it will go there later. It can't jump time. It cannot go back and do it earlier than you've done it. So I don't see a problem. Splitting event store is a concern mainly of operations and costs. So as I said before, I mentioned it before, if you are able to support it and maintain it and you can afford it, split it. especially if you have performance issues. If you don't, you might start using one and then move to multiple.
Thank you. Another question from Thomas. Do you have any UX recommendations on how to cope with eventual consistency from the end user perspective in your UI, like fuzzing the informations that are supposed to be impacted by a comment you just sent? Are there any listed patterns for this?
Yeah, there are. So first of all, I didn't put this as a decoration. I planned to use it, but I didn't have a chance. So here, for example, you have your UI, and it has certain things. And you, for example, stats-based UIs have a group of fields that represent a single intent, or that actually represents the business, the meaningful action in terms of business. And when you click a button, the command goes over there to your backend. And here is your domain, and here is your, for example, event store. And here is your, I will use green because it's proper color. This is your read model. And this is your event store. So it goes here, and then from here, here. And when you want to query it, there is a time gap. And there is some, for example, 100 milliseconds in between. So the question is about how you deal with this time gap. There are multiple ways. So first of all, the command processing returns the result. It's either OK or not OK. So two options. If it is OK for you, there is no reason to consider that if the domain model said yes, you would not get this in the read model eventually. So therefore, if you implement something like single page application, they always keep some piece of state over there. So there is a small thing here. Like if you use Vue.js, you have Vuex, Redux, whatever else. They have some piece of state. Keep the state there and just show that. And if something breaks, there is a disaster happening here, it might signal back to the UI that I didn't do that. Sorry, man, it just didn't go. So maybe you need to revert. It happens sometimes when you try to post something, and then it's posted, and then eventually it gets the cross sign. I've seen several systems like that. So it signals you that it wasn't able to complete. And it didn't use event sourcing as such. It just was simulating the action because of the performance reasons. You can do exactly the same. Also, you can change, you can think about, because I've seen situations like the screen with some sort of form. And this is a kind of classic old-fashioned UI with a save button. And then when you click save, you send command to the backend. But at the same time, when the backend replies, you transition user to another screen with a list of elements. And this guy is this record. And it's not showing the updated state. Again, you can keep state on the UI. If you don't use SPA, it may become harder. But maybe it's not a good idea to jump people to the list, because what they want is if you change the information in this field, you have a small button, maybe inline changes, it's saved, and then you stay in the same screen. It just becomes from editing mode to read mode again. And then when this happens, it's a very short time for transition to actually process in the read model. I saw another application that when they do that, they start to spin, and they wait until they query the API, and they have some attributes. They're coming across all the events and metadata, and then read model has a signal like a timestamp or version of an entity that says I'm the actual version, because the domain model can return the version back, the updated version. And then your read model returns the same, and then you know what happened. So you can just wait a little bit if you want to. So this is just a couple of patterns that we normally use.
Thank you. Question from Fran. Does Event Store offer a way to store snapshots?
Snapshots of what? Yeah, because it's a technical term like snapshot of the file system, virtual machines. Event stores can store things that are in streams, and these things are called events. And if you want to store something that represents a snapshot, you can do it just as well. So what we usually do when we have a lot of events, so we have, for example, an order stream, like 1, 2, 3, and then there's a bunch of events over here in the stream. And then at some point we accumulate like 1,000 of them, and then we produce and write a state representation in order snapshot 1, 2, 3, and then there will be 1, and it represents the full state. So the only thing you need to have in your aggregate entity is that it needs to return the whole state, and then you can apply it. So then when you recover the entity, you first read this, and then you read from there. So all this from some 1,000 plus, and it will be maybe like 3 of them. So this is the second step. So you can store snapshots. It's just another event because it's a property bag. There is nothing more to it, plus metadata.
That's good. So, question from Oscar. Let's imagine the scenario where the business problem is great matching for event sourcing, but your company is traditional, so using relational approach and reluctant to change. How would you persuade them for using event sourcing?
Well, don't tell them to use event sourcing. They don't need to care, because it's up to developers or what kind of patterns they apply, what kind of system they build. And nobody from the business will look at their code and say, oh my God, event sourcing, and they have a heart attack. If they don't allow you to use event store or any specialized products to store your events, you can end up, like I said, what Damon and Co did. So they use relational database. So you can use Martin, which is the document database / event store framework for Postgres, and is maintained by a guy called Oscar. So maybe it's you, Oscar, I don't know. Or you can use.
I think that's the same Oscar.
Yes. So if you wanted me to promote Martin, I would happily do that. So I never use Martin as event store, but I'm quite sure it's possible. So the thing is, you don't tell them. If you can't use specialized product for event store, you might use a framework that simulates one for you. So either SQL Stream Store, Martin, or whatever else is available in other languages.
Right, thank you. Another question from Mateusz Nowak. Can we use event store projections as read models? If yes, how to query, for example, account balance greater than 100? I know how to do it with database, but event store keeps projection state as JSON.
Yeah, I would say don't do that, because event store projections in event store internally, we are a bit hesitant. I mean, it's a nice feature, and there are some useful projections. And usually we use internal projections for partitioning events, but we rarely use them to create read model, because it's not easy. As I said, it creates you still a key value store. So it's not easy, and it has quite a lot of performance implications. So imagine this, that there are standard projections like category projection, event type projections. They don't create new events. They emit so-called linked events, and they're very, very small. So they link to original events. And when you read them, you actually get a resolved event with original event link. And then it will sort of deliver to you in a subscription. But already have this enabled. If you have a lot of events, every single one of them, it triggers a new write to event store. And even if you have a snapshot projection, it will replace, if you have max TTL on the stream for one event, for example, not TTL, max count, it will still write a million of them, and it will need to scavenge 999,999 events at the end of the day when you run scavenging, which is a serious operation in its own. So we call it write amplification. It can create a lot of performance issues, so I would be very careful about this. And it's not bringing you, for example, transactional guarantees. Like projections still will queue, and it may be behind the end of the global stream anyway. So if you're looking for transactional read models, that will update immediately when you write an event, you won't get it. It will still lag behind, especially if it's heavy. So I would say if you want to query by arbitrary property, use the database as a read model that has a proper index in that. So it is technically possible. I just don't see a reason of doing that.
Right, thank you. So we are 40 minutes into this panel, and we have 3 remaining questions. So I think we can fit like maybe 2 more. If anyone has any questions, please ask them on Q&A or YouTube. So the question from Leif Butterman: would you apply event sourcing to a primarily CRUD-based application? Let's say a system for storing, managing static information about employees or user account data, etc.
There are 2 sides of it. So if you have a CRUD system and you see that there is no sort of domain complexity involved there, that you would not use event sourcing, because CRUD-based events or property sourcing is not something you want in event source system. It's basically an anti-pattern. Another thing is that if you're talking about that particular example, employee store, remember about GDPR. If you're in Europe, you will get hit by that if you don't take precautions. So I'd rather have be careful about storing private information and at least separate it to another stream that you can easily delete or apply advanced techniques like crypto deletion. There will be a blog post on Event Store blog about dealing with GDPR and event source systems sometime in June, I guess. But sometimes you just discover that it's not that cruddy anymore, because employee record may be cruddy in terms of like you create and like date of birth never changes, the name rarely changes, the address changes now and then. You don't need to keep historical record. It's perfectly fine. So don't event source it. But if you use, for example, holiday management, there is quite a lot of events involved, like approval process, consolidation, reconciliation, and validation, and checks in external systems, stuff like that. So there it might be relevant. So you can, if you have an employee management system, don't think about, I will just event source everything or nothing, because you can just keep the master data, what's so-called of sorts, some catalog outside in another database, like the document database. It never changes. And the process that runs beside it, it might be even other-bound context. It might as well be another aggregate. So keep it separate, and then event source only that part. It's perfectly okay. So yeah, I guess.
So we have Leif on the call. He wanted to join and speak, so I allowed him. Leif, can you say something?
Yes, sure. So first of all, thank you very much for your answer. And I have related to a diagram that you draw earlier, and it's the communication between the UI and the API, where the command is sent and then it gets a okay or not okay back. And I was wondering if this means just, okay, I acknowledge that I have received the event and I will process it, but I'm not saying that, you know, this is a valid, sorry, I said event, I meant command.
Okay, so you're talking about Fireandforget commands or something like that, right?
Yeah, exactly. So
yeah, okay. Yeah. No. I'm not a big fan of that. So imagine this is your domain model. And there is an aggregate, like, again, I will use the order example. And there is an API here. And there may be application layer. So you come here, and there is a HTTP request. What it does, it can do the validation for simple rules. Like this property of the command cannot be empty, or it must contain a validate, because you just receive arbitrary JSON and you never know if this actually serializes. So serialization concerns, preliminary validation concerns, and stuff like that is handled here. And then it calls to the domain model, and then the domain model reach out to event store, reconstruct the aggregate, returns it back, and then the order aggregate, protecting its own invariance and ensuring it's in invalid state always, either executes the operation or not. And all this time, this request is holding on and waiting for response. As soon as you say yes or no, the domain model returns the result to the API through the application service, and then you either return OK or not OK. And this is not ACK and NACK. This is actually OK or not OK. So yes. I executed it. You can use Fireandforget commands. You can. If you're absolutely sure that this operation will happen, you don't need to reply. Because something could never fail is sending an email address or ordering a PDF report. So who cares? You just say, I acknowledge that I received it, and you will get a result eventually later. But no, most of the time, in 99% of the cases, you want to have a response, and the commands, the domain model can tell you no, so you need to inform the user that this command was not executed. And it happens transactionally. So, and this scales, because the command side has no implications like read model are always single-threaded synchronous because they take care of specific order, unless that you don't care about ordering, but this is another concern. This can scale. You can have multiple instances of these things because they always go to event store to fetch the latest state for every command. So we can have tons of them running in like Kubernetes, whatever you use. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm wondering what are the best practices in the response? So the OK response, would that contain any data, or is it like a best practice to just have an empty response?
There is a lot of discussion. I saw a lot of discussions. I would say do whatever you prefer. I'm not a big fan of returning the data. It means that I basically violates the command query responsibility segregation and even CQS, command query separation concerns. But I could return some meta. For example, if I got an aggregate updated and mutated from version 1 to version 3, I would return a new version of this. And then maybe I return some timestamps. I might return some trace IDs, whatever else you use for. Maybe you have distributed traces. So all this can be considered as metadata, and you're free to return as much metadata as you want. And the version can be useful and timestamp for example, fetching the read model, understanding if it's in correct state or not. So I would not return any business data, but I would return meta.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Leif. All right. Shall event which, so that's a question from Jamie Ilkevich. Shall event which are stored in the event store actually be used as integration events, which are propagated to other systems or about that context?
Yeah. I was waiting for it to happen. Yeah, I love this topic because integration concerns are orthogonal to event sourcing as such, but event sourcing becomes very useful because what usually happens, people use the main events for integration. So you have one context here and one context here, and they use, for example, a message broker to communicate. So you put an event here, this one reads it, and does something inside. So when the problem is that, for example, it has its own database and it has a message broker. So if the command is executed, first it tries to update the state in a database, and second, it publishes an event to the message broker. Not always you can do it transactionally. And if you are not able to do it transactionally, you have a very big risk that this guy would never hear from you. And then you can end up in an inconsistent state on the other side, which is pretty dangerous. So event sourcing, if you use event store, for example, eliminates this concern entirely, because what you do, you only do the first one, right? But then the question comes, shall we use the main events for integration? The question is, it depends on the relationship between those two. So I would still not allow them to subscribe to your event store, for example. I wouldn't do that. For the simple reason that it's just that you're closing your doors for yourself to be able to kind of detach from them. And you can still sort of have a small subscription over here that reads all the events real time and puts them in the broker in the same contract. So essentially, what they become, they start to conform to you. So they either can use anti-corruption layer, or they can become a conformist to your domain because they need to use your language and they need to adopt and process your events. The risks there, of course, that this guy might become sort of open host and published language type of bound context because it has a lot of people who depend on them. And they lose the ability to manipulate, to evolve their domain model freely, because they always need to think about someone else consuming their data in that format that they expect to consume, the format of the schema of events that you have at that particular moment. And then every upgrade that you plan for your domain model will have serious implications outside of your own control. So what you could do, you can, over here, in that subscriber that publishes events to the broker, you could convert them to more stable contract and maybe enrich them, going to your read models and fetching information that's missing there and publishing more so-called fat events to the broker. And then keep this version, keep this stable, because the subscriber, so imagine this, you have version 1 of some event, you have version 2 of some event. The subscriber can just convert to the same integration event and keep the contract stable. It can deal with any number of versions as soon as it can fetch the same information somewhere and put it in event as it was. And by doing that, you basically isolate yourself and you create published language, but you decouple your domain model from that language and keep that language stable. Events that are going outside of the bound context are in no way different of any kind of public API. So as soon as you publish something and let others consume that, it's your public contract, you have to stick to it because they will depend on you. So therefore, like a REST API, keep it versioned, keep it stable. And if you might start with just publishing events as they are. At some point, you say, OK, I want to have more freedom. It gets scary. A lot of people subscribe to my events. And you create this conversion. Even if it's just for the start, it's just one-on-one. And then you can reach it. So yeah, move gradually. Don't go overboard. Don't start with that, but eventually come to that pattern.
Right. Question from Vitor Arrays. What's your opinion on Axon framework? Have you worked with it?
No, I haven't. I know that people building the framework are very decent event sourcing practitioners, so I guess they address majority of the concerns. It's not my technological space because it's JVM based, and I usually work with .NET based applications and some JavaScript. So I couldn't say much. I am not a big fan of framework though, because again, okay, we release new features, so you can do this now. How you do it, we don't care. We don't tell you. You need to look at the source code. So every big framework has this implication that you get married to them and you cannot move away and you cannot manipulate it easily and stuff like that. The same trade-off as with any kind of framework. When it comes to event sourcing, it's a lot of small details and heavy lifting here and there. So do it yourself or use a framework, it's your choice, but you may end up adopting to the framework instead of moving freely like you want to. But it may save you some time. But I don't have personal opinion about it.
Right. Another question from Duncan. Is there any plan or a way to have a cloud-hosted event store as a service?
Yes, and it's announced, and you can reach our blog and read about it. We have a group of dedicated, brilliant people working on that, and led by Zach, who is the lead of the cloud project, and we expect the early access version available during summer, and hopefully GA later in the year, but definitely this year there will be a hosted version, managed cloud version for major cloud providers.
Question from Craig. Do you have any tips for improving speed of generation of read models? For example, where there are lots of events and read models need to be completely rebuilt. Could a read model snapshot be used?
Yes, you could, just need to evaluate the risks. So for example, if you're pretty comfortable with your current read model, so it's up to date, you can just reach out to that and build your new read model, use it as a snapshot, like you said. So, but there are a bunch of things. Scaling of read models is a topic on its own, and we briefly touched it during yesterday's Event Store webinar. I think we should plan something more detailed discussion where I can demonstrate some patterns. If I list them, for example, you hold the checkpoints for every subscription, not exactly for projection or read model, but for subscription that can contain multiple projections because they kind of belong together. The checkpoint write, for example, is a database operation. And what you could do if your projections are important, and you should take care they are important, you can just avoid writing checkpoint and keep it running and write it for every 1,000 events, for example, or end by time. You could do the same with read model updates. If you have relaxed SLAs in terms of consistency, for example, for search, I always give this example for Elastic because I had a hard time dealing with that. Elastic doesn't really work with atomic updates. It's not that fast, but it works really well with batched operations. So you could shovel 1,000 documents, and it will take probably the same amount of time or twice as much of process 1,000 documents than you will process one. So then you can accumulate, because for search, nobody really expects the search results or the data that is just changed to be searchable in a moment. People kind of know that search takes time to index. Then you can say, okay, I accumulate a batch of read models and then shovel them back. And if there are entities that are frequently changing, the batch might end up just building in memory because you will eliminate some of the updates. You can combine them, consolidate them, aggregate. And then for example, 1,000 updates, you will actually have 500 database updates. But you need to take care that you know that what time it takes to build a batch, and you may be shoveled by time as well. And then you need to ensure that this particular one is under heavy load, and people don't really care that the data is available immediately in that read model, so it's okay. And of course, the valid thing is to keep read models in memory, at least a portion of it, and stuff like that. I did an experiment a couple of times. I talked about using actor model for read models. I think it's pretty interesting because they basically do not need to update database all the time because they are there. Always available, and then they can shovel to the disk to the database from time to time instead, but they can answer to queries. And the data will be available in read models much faster. So another way is to enable it horizontally scale. So if you are able to partition it by some ID, then you can just have as many instances as you have partitions. So then you will just increase performance by horizontally scaling it.
Right, we have 3 minutes, so I think that's going to be the last question, unless you are really quick. That's a question from Patrick. What are the properties of the system that you would consider it to be event source? What are your heuristics other than the domain maturity that you already mentioned?
Yeah, from the start, you might have joined later. I mentioned that the main model that has sort of essential complexity in it. So it's not the extremely simple domain like we discussed, some catalog or collection of things that can be just put in a document and stored there because they never change. If you look at an entity and see that its life cycle, for example, is exceeding 10 different state transitions, that you may think about applying event sourcing because clearly there is a process involved. And this should not be property change. It should be some actions that have business meaning and they're described in ubiquitous language, and they're all kind of different. If you have, of course, a life cycle exceeding 10 events and all of them are saying item was updated, that's probably you don't want event source system because you're doing CRUD anyway. So time is important. Sometimes you just need to know what happened in the past. And you can, of course, shovel it in some sort of historical table or a document with an array of things that happened. For example, in ABAX, we were implementing driving behavior, and we need to have a window of data in order to calculate the things because it's sort of aggregation and then some math on top of that. So we had to do that, but then we can go around a bit of event sourcing. There are no real aggregates there. There are no real transactions. The ordering is not that important. So there are a lot of relaxed concerns. So I would say there are a lot of ways of doing event source system, and there are a lot of domains where you can apply it. It's just I know that people mostly work on business applications, and then there you need to be careful. So if there is a process that involves time and it happens over time, and it can go back and forth, then maybe exceptions can happen. But seriously consider applying event sourcing. What I want to say is that, yeah, Sergio says cake is live because you need to have some heavy lifting up front in order to be able to enter this world. But as soon as you enter it, it's like riding a bicycle. So you started it, you learned, you felt sometimes, and you got help from others. And then you master it eventually. And then you can just do it because it becomes much easier. And all of the things that you discovered in the past will help you moving forward. relational databases were new at the time as well, and people were very skeptical about them because they had hierarchical databases. So time passed, we see it like we take it for granted, and we say this is how we do it. We shovel everything to relational database, so we end up in another extreme. So for now, event sourcing is a bit new, but historically, like look at Greg's talks, he always mentioned Mesopotamia clay tablets as a sort of first event sourcing. People used to have stacks of documents. I have documents from the Netherlands where all the paperwork from the tax authorities was done by paper. So I stack it, and I need to keep it for some time because it's how it was done before. And now I do it electronically, but it's the same kind of thing. So yeah, there are a lot of applications for event sourcing. I don't really agree with people saying that's a niche thing. It's not really a niche. Processes are everywhere.
Right, thank you, Alexey. We have 3 questions left. We are not going to answer them today, but we do have a channel on DDD SecureOS Slack, so I would encourage you to join this channel. And I'm going to commit to Alexey, but if you have some time, if you could answer these questions later on this.
Yeah, definitely. I'm in that Slack, and people talk to me, so reach out. It's the best way not to reach out in private. Just put it in the event sourcing channel if you want to, and then there are much more people there than just me, and some of them have even more experience than I do, and I think people are ready and eager to share their experiences and give some practical advice.
We also have Twitter and the hashtag on Twitter, so you can tweet there. Okay, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you everyone for coming. Yeah, I hope
very
you enjoyed
insightful.
I'll see you next time.
Yeah.